Hey, anatomy and physiology students, we are on our last topic of the nervous system. Feels like we've been on the nervous system forever. It's been weeks and weeks, literally weeks and weeks we've been doing this. This is the last topic. Today's topic is the autonomic nervous system, which hopefully you have a little bit of memory of. There it is on our little flow chart. It's right there. Let's remember that we start with the CNS. That's your brain spinal cord. Everything outside your CNS or central nervous system is your PNS, your peripheral nervous system. So that's all your nerves, cranial nerves and spinal nerves. Then we separated that into an afferent sensory division, sending sensory info in, and an efferent motor division, sending commands out. Then our motor division had two separate parts. The somatic nervous system, which sent commands to skeletal muscle, and the autonomic nervous system, which sent commands to cardiac muscle and to smooth muscle and to glands. And today we are doing the autonomic nervous system. We're going to talk about it in general, and we're going to talk about its two components, which are known as the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. So that is our topic for today. Okay, there are a pair of nicknames we got to be aware of. The sympathetic division is often referred to as the fight or flight division. And this will become apparent as we go through the things that this nervous system causes to happen in your body. Now, the parasympathetic response division is often known as the rest and digest part. And that too will become apparent as we get into the sorts of things this nervous system is going to cause to happen. All right, let's start initially by looking at some of those effectors. So we know the autonomic nervous system is going to have three effectors, and we see two of them here. We are going to see the cardiac muscle right here in the heart, as well as smooth muscle over here in the wall of the stomach. This is actually a microscopic view of the stomach over here. Now, like all effectors of your autonomic nervous system, these two guys are involuntary. So one of the things to remember about the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, is that its effectors are involuntary. So these are two of the three: cardiac muscle in the heart, smooth muscle in organs like the stomach, the intestines, airways, blood vessels, etc. All right. What about that third one, though? What was that third effector of the ANS? Well, that's going to be glands. And we actually see a pair of glands that we've met previously right here. This guy, that purple circle around him, that's the submandibular gland. And this big old one on the outside of the cheek right there, that is the parotid gland. Those are two salivary glands we met earlier. So glands are another effector of the ANS. And of course, glands are also involuntary. You can't control how much saliva or pancreatic juice you are going to make. So those are our three effectors. Now, what we can do is contrast that to the effectors of the somatic nervous system. And all the things I see here are skeletal muscles. The somatic nervous system is going to have skeletal muscles as its effector. Now remember, skeletal muscles are generally considered to be voluntary. So whereas the ANS is involuntary, the somatic nervous system is voluntary. And you should look at some of these guys here. I'm going to circle some of these guys here. you should take a moment as I circle some of these guys and ask yourself what these guys do, because these are all ones that we met in lab from last week. So you should pause this and ask yourself, do I know what each of these guys do? Okay. With that, let's look at some other differences between the somatic and autonomic nervous system. We already know somatic, voluntary, controls skeletal muscle. Autonomic, involuntary, controls cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Okay, another difference lies in the neural pathway, how the neurons go from the central nervous system, which we see here represented by the spinal cord. So how we get from the CNS to the effector. Somatic is up top here, and notice how the somatic pathway starts in the ventral horn of the cord here, comes out the ventral root, and goes to the effector, and it's just a single motor neuron. It is just one motor neuron that makes that passage from the cord, from the CNS to the effector. Single motor neuron. And what do we see on the axon there? What are all these guys? Shout it out if you remember. Those guys are Schwann cells. So we have one neuron, and it is myelinated. It's actually like heavily myelinated. It's really wrapped up by those Schwann cells. Now, if we contrast this to the autonomic pathway, well, we're starting in the lateral horn of the cord here. We still come out the ventral root. But look, there's not one neuron. There are two neurons. There's one, and then there's another one. So it is a two-neuron pathway. The first neuron is myelinated, although it's lightly myelinated. The Schwann cells aren't as thick. But the second neuron, the one that actually ends up going to our target tissue, is not myelinated at all. It's unmyelinated. So which pathway do you think is faster here? Definitely the somatic one, because it's just a single neuron. You don't have to waste any time for the signal to cause the release of neurotransmitter and a new signal to be generated. Just a single neuron and heavily myelinated. That's definitely faster than two neurons, lightly myelinated, unmyelinated, with a synapse to traverse in the middle. Okay, that's a big difference between these two. Another difference involves the neurotransmitters, and we'll expand on this later. The somatic neurotransmitter onto the effector is this compound called acetylcholine. The autonomic pathway releases acetylcholine at this synapse between the two neurons, but then onto the effector organ, it's either going to be acetylcholine or this other neurotransmitter known as norepinephrine. So we have a transmitter difference as well. Okay, that is good. We got those differences. We're kind of summing them up and adding a little bit more in this particular slide here. Somatics up top, cell body in the CNS, one heavily myelinated axon releasing acetylcholine onto skeletal muscle as the effector organ. And the response, the effect, is always stimulatory. We're always going to get that muscle to contract. Now, the autonomic nervous system, I want you to kind of ignore this guy, this part for now. We'll hit this later, but let's ignore that for now. The autonomic nervous system, they're showing you both ways, both the sympathetic, the fight or flight one, and the parasympathetic, the rest and digest. And I'm not too worried about the differences between those two yet. But notice in each case we have 1, 2 neurons. So 1, 2 neurons. And there's a synapse in between, and at the synapse we release, in both cases, acetylcholine. Then onto the target tissue, we release either acetylcholine, which is the parasympathetic one, or norepi, which is the sympathetic one. Then our target tissue, as we've said earlier, is either smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. Now, our response can either be stimulatory, like we can get these muscles to contract, or inhibitory, we can get them to relax. With the glands, we can either get them to secrete more or secrete less. So we can go either way. It depends on the neurotransmitter and on the type of receptor that the effector organ is going to have. All right, so we've got some differences, and we're learning a little bit about the ANS. We got to expand on the ANS a lot more. What I want you to notice is that the ANS has neurons going to all of these structures pictured here, okay? And remember, the ANS had two divisions. The ANS has two divisions, right? The sympathetic, also known as the fight or flight, and the parasympathetic, also known as the rest and digest. And they're showing you the pathway of how we get from the CNS to all of these organs. Notice how the sympathetic pathway, we got neurons coming out of the spinal cord, T1 all the way down to L2. For parasympathetic, we got neurons coming out of the brainstem, as well as spinal cord S2 to S4. Now, what I really want you to see here is how organs are generally getting both sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons going to them. So look at the heart here. Heart has sympathetic neurons and parasympathetic neurons going to it. The lungs, sympathetic and parasympathetic. The eyeball, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, this is a concept known as dual innervation. And this is going to be crucial for that important H word that we learned like on the first day. I'm spelling it here, but hopefully you have figured out what it is. This concept of dual innervation is important for homeostasis, because what this dual innervation allows for is this phenomenon known as antagonistic control. What that means is the sympathetic stimulation will do one thing to the effector, and the parasympathetic will do the opposite. So, for example, sympathetic stimulation will increase heart rate, while parasympathetic stimulation will decrease heart rate. So what this does, it allows us to change things in different directions, which is crucial for keeping the body systems in the right range. Think about things like heart rate, blood pressure, breathing rate, diameter of blood vessels and airways. We got to get those things just right. We don't want them too big or too small. So we need them to go in both directions. And antagonistic control allows us to do that. But we can't do antagonistic control unless we've also got dual innervation. Okay. Now that we've got that concept down, let's keep on moving. Got some more things to learn. Now, earlier we said the parasympathetic was called the rest and digest division. And as you might have guessed, it's going to stimulate a lot of digestive activities. But that's not the only thing the parasympathetic division stimulates. Not only does it stimulate digestion, but also another pair of D words: defecation, pooping, right? And diuresis, peeing. So we have 3 D things here. So sometimes the parasympathetic branch is called the D division. Now, the sympathetic division is also sometimes known as the E division. We already said it was the fight or flight division. It's also the E division because it is very much turned on when you are exercising, when you are excited, or also when you're embarrassed or you are in some sort of emergency situation. Okay, There's actually another pair of nicknames. The parasympathetic division, because it emanates, its neurons begin in the brainstem and the sacral cord. The parasympathetic division is known as the craniosacral division. Whereas the sympathetic division, its neurons come out of T1 to L2, as opposed to the brainstem and S2 to S4. So the sympathetic division is known as the thoracolumbar division. All right, and we see the concept of dual innervation being shown here as well, as they show us basically the same organs for the parasymp and the sympathetic division. Not entirely, like skin. It's getting sympathetic only, adrenal gland. But for the most part, we got that dual innervation situation. Okay, so remember, parasympathetic, craniosacral. We got cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10 coming out of the brainstem, as well as sacral nerves 2 through 4. Sympathetic, thoracolumbar, because we got thoracic nerves 1 through 12. So all the thoracic ones, right? As well as the first 2 lumbars, T1 to L2. Okay, if we compare these two guys, we know they had some similarity in terms of how the neurons got to the effector. So 1, 2 neuron pathway in each one. The first neuron is always called the preganglionic neuron. He's also known as a cholinergic neuron because he releases acetylcholine. So in the sympathetic pathway, the first neuron is a cholinergic preganglionic. In the parasympathetic pathway, the first neuron is a cholinergic preganglionic. The site of the synapse actually occurs at a structure called the autonomic ganglion. Remember, a ganglion is a cluster of cell bodies. That's where our second neuron begins. Now, our second neuron is known as the postganglionic neuron. Now, the sympathetic one is called an adrenergic neuron because it releases norepinephrine, which is very similar to the hormone adrenaline. So, in the sympathetic pathway, our second neuron is an adrenergic postganglionic neuron, whereas in the parasympathetic pathway, the second neuron is cholinergic postganglionic because it releases acetylcholine. Now, I want you to notice the lengths here, okay? The preganglionics are different. The sympathetic is a short preganglionic because the ganglion is actually really close to the spinal cord. The parasympathetic has a long preganglionic because the ganglion is close to the effector organ. And of course, with a short first neuron, you got to have a long second one. And with a long first neuron, you got to have a short second one. All right. Let's keep on going. If we look at another picture here showing us the same idea, we've got parasympathetic coming out of the brainstem, short preganglionic getting to the ganglion, long preganglionic getting to the ganglion, and short preganglionic going onward. Similar thing down here, S2 to S4, long preganglionic, short postganglionic. Then for the sympathetic pathway, T1 to L2, short preganglionic because those ganglia are nearby, long postganglionic getting out to our effector organ. All right, if we look at the parasympathetic again, like I mentioned earlier, we got cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. Remember what those are. Number 3 is the oculomotor nerve. Number 7 is the facial nerve. 9 is the glossopharyngeal, and 10 is the vagus. Oculomotor, of course, going to things in the eye, musculature in the eye. Facial nerve, going to glands in the face. Glossopharyngeal, also going to a salivary gland. The vagus nerve going to thoracic organs like the heart and the lungs, as well as digestive organs, liver, gallbladder, stomach, pancreas, intestines. Then S2 to S4, we've got the the parasympathetic neurons going to the genitalia, as well as urinary organs and the distal large intestine, the end of the colon here, the rectum. All right. So that is our parasympathetic pathway. It's not too bad. Now, the sympathetic division is going to get a little bit more interesting, let's say. It's getting more interesting because there's more organs we got to go to. We got to get to all those visceral organs in the abdomen and the thorax, as well as sweat glands all over the body, as well as arrector pili muscles all over the skin. Remember those arrector pili, the ones that cause hair follicles to stand on end? And vascular smooth muscle, so smooth muscle in blood vessels throughout the body. So there are a lot of ways the sympathetic neurons can travel. Now, to get into that, we got to review a little bit. If we check out our spinal cord, remember we got a dorsal root, we got a ventral root. They combine to make a spinal nerve. Spinal nerve then branches to give us a dorsal ramus towards the back and a ventral ramus to the front. Now, what we're going to be interested in are these branches off the ventral ramus called the rami communicantes. We see them labeled down here. There's one called a white ramus communicans and one called a gray ramus communicans. And those we're going to be really interested in. Okay. Let's start the first way that sympathetic neurons get where they're going. We're going to call this spinal nerve pathway number 1. We're starting in the lateral horn of the spinal cord. Remember, T1 to L2. The preganglionic, the first neuron, comes out that ventral root, into the spinal nerve, into the ventral ramus, then into the structure right here, the second one right here, which is the white ramus communicans. Remember, the first neuron in our pathway, the preganglionic, is myelinated. That's why we're using the word white here to describe the white ramus communicans. And that's where our first neuron's going to go to get to the ganglion. And there is a ganglion near the spinal cord called the sympathetic trunk ganglion. And that is where our first neuron, our preganglionic, synapses with our second one, our postganglionic. Then our second neuron comes out that gray ramus communicans back into that ventral ramus, onward to the effector, which could be arrector pili muscles in the skin, sweat glands in the skin, blood vessels in the skin, and we're talking neck, torso, and limbs here. So this is how we get to effectors in the skin of our neck, our torso, and our limbs. We use a spinal nerve pathway, out of the cord, ventral root, spinal nerve, ventral ramus, white ramus communicans, sympathetic trunk ganglion, gray ramus communicans, ventral ramus, onward to the effector. All right. If there's a spinal nerve pathway number 1, as you might have guessed it, there's a spinal nerve pathway number 2. It's just another way we get to skin in the neck, torso, and limbs. Okay, just another way we get to that. Because as you might have guessed, if we're starting in L1 and L2, if I go back for a second, if we're starting from T1 to L2, and we go on that level, we're kind of limiting where we can be, right? So we got to have a situation where we can go up and go down to get to other effectors. So what might happen is very similar. It's going to be a slight difference. We're still starting in the lateral horn of the cord, out the ventral root, spinal nerve, ventral ramus, white ramus communicans, and we get into that ganglion right there, but we don't stop. That's the difference. We don't stop here. We either go down or up to another ganglion. In this case, we went up one level here to one ganglion above. Synapse there with our postganglionic neuron. It then leaves via a gray ramus communicans, ventral ramus, onward to our effector. And still, same thing as pathway number 1, effectors in the skin of the neck, torso, and limbs. This is just a way to get to more places in the body. All right, but where else do we need to go? Besides skin in the neck, torso, and limbs, there's other places we need to go, right? Yeah. So let's figure out how we get there. Our next pathway is called the postganglionic sympathetic nerve pathway. And this is how we're going to get to effectors in the thorax. So I'm talking esophagus, heart, lungs, blood vessels in there as well. Plus how we get into effectors of the skin in the head, plus organs in your neck, and even structures in your eye. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to begin again in the lateral horn of the cord. Remember, T1 to L2, lateral horn of the cord, out the ventral root, into a spinal nerve, onward to a ventral ramus, into that ganglion. And we stop in that ganglion. We synapse with our postganglionic nerve. But here's the difference. We don't go into a ramus communicans here and back to the ventral ramus. Now we take a nerve out of that ganglion. A sympathetic nerve, like there are cardiac sympathetic nerves, for example, that'll go to the heart. So we take a nerve out of that ganglion and we go onward to our target tissue. Okay? So notice we had a lot of similarity. It was just till the end where we had a difference. All right, we're not done yet. Because if you notice, we didn't do the abdominal organ, right? We didn't do the abdomen. We got abdominal and pelvic organs we got to get to. This is going to be very similar to the last one. Starting lateral horn, remember T1 to L2, out, ventral root, spinal nerve, white ramus communicans. We go into the ganglion, but we don't stop. Last time we stopped in the ganglion. This time we leave the ganglion via a nerve, and these nerves leaving the ganglion to go to the abdominal and pelvic organs are called splanchnic nerves. And we'll take that nerve to a ganglion along that nerve, okay, called a collateral ganglion. And in there we'll meet our postganglionic neuron, and he will go onward to our target tissue. The collateral ganglions are sometimes called prevertebral because they're anterior to the vertebral column. All right, so close to being done with these pathways. Only one more, and this one's totally different. Yet, it's got some similarities. Even though I say it's totally different, it still has similarities. Starting in our lateral horn, leaving via that ventral root to the spinal nerve, to the white ramus communicans, to some splanchnic nerves, onward to the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland sits on top of the kidney. The adrenal gland has an exterior called the cortex. I don't really care about that right now. And an interior called the medulla. In the medulla, we're going to find modified postganglionic neurons. These little yellow guys right here. They release a pair of hormones, epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, and norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline. And these hormones are sympathetic hormones. They're going to be released into the blood, and they're going to stimulate effector organs in the same way sympathetic neurons would. By the way, it's about 85% epinephrine, 15% norepinephrine in this mix that gets into the blood vessels. So this is our final pathway. Wow, that was a lot. All right, I can pretty much guarantee you're going to see a picture of one of these pathways on your exam. You're not going to have to draw me one or anything like that, but I'm going to show you a picture, ask you about some labels and things, okay? All right. So, let's look at neurotransmitters. We've touched on this already. One of the neurotransmitters we need to know is acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is released from the first neuron in the pathway. The first neuron releases acetylcholine onto the second. The preganglionic releases acetylcholine onto the postganglionic neuron in both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic pathway. But then the difference arises on the target tissue. Our sympathetic pathway, our sympathetic postganglionic neuron, is an adrenergic neuron because it releases norepinephrine. The parasympathetic pathway, its second neuron, its postganglionic neuron, releases acetylcholine. So we got acetylcholine being released in 3 spots here, norepinephrine being released in 1. Both of our initial preganglionic neurons are cholinergic, releasing acetylcholine. Our postganglionic parasympathetic is cholinergic, but our postganglionic sympathetic is adrenergic, releasing norepinephrine. So we still need to figure out what kind of receptors these neurotransmitters hit and then what actions they have. Now, receptors for acetylcholine are called cholinergic receptors. And everywhere I release acetylcholine, I am going to find cholinergic receptors on the neighboring neuron or effector. So in my sympathetic pathway, first neuron releases acetylcholine, I'm going to have cholinergic receptors on that second neuron. In my parasympathetic pathway, first neuron releases acetylcholine, I'm going to have cholinergic receptors on that second neuron. The effect of acetylcholine onto a neuron is to cause an action potential in it. Okay? Now, acetylcholine is also released onto our effector organ. Oh, I said organ. What's an organ? In the parasympathetic pathway. Acetylcholine is also released on the skeletal muscle in the somatic motor pathway. Just wanted to throw that in there real quick. Now, as you might notice by looking at this picture, there are actually different kinds of cholinergic receptors. There's cholinergic nicotinic receptors, which we find on our postganglionic neurons in our skeletal muscle. But then there's also cholinergic muscarinic receptors, which we find on our effectors, so smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. All right, nicotinic receptors. Notice, I'm going to go back for a second. Notice that they're on my neurons here and my skeletal muscle. And the purpose of acetylcholine binding to the nicotinic receptors is to cause the neurons or the skeletal muscle to have an action potential. So how do we get that? Well, we get that by opening a sodium channel. So this is a nicotinic receptor right here. Acetylcholine binds to it. The sodium channel opens up. Sodium rushes in. That sodium ingress is going to cause a graded potential, which will then generate probably an action potential. Now, why are these called nicotinic receptors? Because not only do they respond to the normal acetylcholine released from your neurons, they also respond to nicotine, which we find in these nasty things right here. Okay. Now, the other receptor type was the cholinergic muscarinic. We find those on the effectors, so on the cardiac muscle, the smooth muscle, or the gland. Now, muscarinic receptors are not a simple ion channel. Muscarinic receptors are going to, when they're stimulated by the binding of acetylcholine, they're going to cause the production of other intracellular messengers, so messengers within the cell. And it kind of depends on who the cell is. Is it a muscle cell? Is it a gland cell? What exactly is it? And those intracellular chemicals can cause the muscle cell to contract more, contract less. Depends on what organ we're talking about. Could cause the gland cell to secrete more, secrete less. Remember, we have options, all right? Muscarinic receptors also respond to a chemical called muscarine, which is found in mushrooms like this guy right there. Okay. As far as what acetylcholine does. So remember, the nickname of this system is the rest and digest system. And that kind of lets you predict what kind of things are going to happen. Also remember that another nickname of this system was the D division. Digestion, defecation, and diuresis. So, when acetylcholine is released in our target tissue, let's figure out what that target tissue does. If it is the heart, acetylcholine is going to cause heart rate to decrease. Remember, rest, right? Rest and digest. Acetylcholine will decrease heart rate. Now, this is a urinary bladder right here. What we can see is the smooth muscle in the urinary bladder. Acetylcholine will cause that smooth muscle to contract, which helps push urine out of the urinary bladder. We got digestive organs over here. In general, just remember, acetylcholine is going to stimulate digestive activity. So more muscle contraction in digestive organs and more secretions in digestive organs. So salivary glands will secrete more, stomach, pancreas, liver, intestines secrete more, stomach, intestines, their musculature, their smooth muscle is going to contract more. Okay? All right. Let's get rid of that arrow there. Let's keep on going. Let's talk about the sympathetic pathway a bit. Sympathetic pathway, first neuron acetylcholine, second neuron norepinephrine. So norepinephrine is released onto our effector organ. The receptor is called an adrenergic receptor because it responds to adrenaline or epinephrine as well. Okay? Now there's actually two types of adrenergic receptors. There's alphas and there are betas, and they do different things on different organs. We're not going to get into that. Maybe if you take a real physiology class down the road, you'll get into that. All right. What do norepinephrine and epinephrine do? Remember fight or flight, okay? Use that to kind of guide you, all right? So heart rate, going to go up. Not only does heart rate go up, but the force of contraction is going to go up too. Norepinephrine and epinephrine are going to inhibit your urinary bladder, stop you from peeing. They're going to inhibit your digestive organs as well. What else? There's more. Blood pressure is going to rise. Arrector pili are going to contract, getting those hairs to stand up to make you look scarier. Sweat glands are going to make more sweat. Airways are going to dilate. Smooth muscle in airways is going to dilate, relax, letting you get more air in and out. Your pupils actually get wider. Parasympathetic makes your pupils get narrower, constricts them. Sympathetic widens them. Think about how somebody gets wide-eyed if they're frightened, okay? So these are all things that make sense in light of that fight or flight idea, all right? All right. Guys, we're almost done. I know we've done a lot here. Got a few more things to discuss. What I want you to notice here is that in the parasympathetic pathway, there is basically a one-to-one relationship. If you got a preganglionic, you got one postganglionic. Beautiful, easy, okay? But in the sympathetic pathway, it's a one-to-many. We didn't see this in the other pictures. The other pictures, I don't know, they didn't want to be too confusing yet. But in this picture, we notice that our sympathetic preganglionic neuron has a lot of branches. What that means is that for every one preganglionic, we're going to get many postganglionics. So that gives us a broad distribution. And what this is going to do, it is going to make your sympathetic response involve more organs. It's going to be more body-wide. Skin, blood vessels, and lots of organs, whereas the parasympathetic pathway is much more localized. Like it just goes to the one organ that we need it to at a particular time. Okay, there's another aspect here. Don't forget that the sympathetic pathway, remember that fifth pathway we had? How we went to the adrenal medulla inside the adrenal gland and got it to release a lot of epinephrine and a little norepinephrine into the bloodstream. And then from the bloodstream, those sympathetic hormones went everywhere. And this also gives the sympathetic response a bigger distribution. It's more body-wide, whereas the parasympathetic one is more local. Okay. Not only do we want to talk about distribution, and sympathetic was the hands-down winner, we also want to talk about duration. Now, when acetylcholine is released onto our effector organ in our parasympathetic pathway, the acetylcholine is quickly broken down by an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase. So the effect of acetylcholine on the effector organ does not last for long. So the parasympathetic response is short-lived. However, the sympathetic response, we're releasing norepinephrine onto our target tissue. And norepinephrine, we don't break it down with an enzyme. Instead, it is slurped back up by the preganglionic neuron. There's a transporter that takes it back into it, kind of recycles it. And that's how we get it out of the cleft here. And that process is slow. And that means our sympathetic response is going to last longer. Which makes sense from a fight or flight perspective, right? You don't want to immediately lose that edge, so to speak. You want to stay kind of organs on alert until you're sure the danger has passed. Now, also, remember, adrenal gland in the sympathetic response puts that epinephrine, norepinephrine into the bloodstream. And it takes a while for it to be removed from the bloodstream and metabolized by the liver. And that stimulates to a long duration of the sympathetic response. Okay. Guys, we're so close to being done. All we got to do is one final exception involving male and female genitalia. We talked about antagonistic control earlier, remember? So sympathetic dilates your pupil. Parasympathetic constricts it. Sympathetic dilates your airways. Parasympathetic constricts. Sympathetic, heart rate up. Parasympathetic, heart rate down. That was antagonistic control, which was good for homeostasis. But there is also situations in the reproductive system where these systems are working together. So there is a synergistic relationship here, more cooperative, that's the word, relationship. Now, obviously, male reproductive system here, we got glands, we got tubes, glands, we got the penis here as well. The parasympathetic stimulation of reproductive organs is primarily going to be responsible for penile erection. So erection is a parasympathetic event. Now you might think if we were just thinking antagonistically, parasympathetic causes erection, sympathetic stops it, but it's not how that works. Sympathetic doesn't have anything to do with erection. Sympathetic stimulation of the glands and muscles is responsible for ejaculation. So parasympathetic erection, sympathetic ejaculation. So it's more cooperative as opposed to counteracting one another. And there is a similar situation in the female. So in the female, the parasympathetic is going to be responsible for the erection, the engorgement of the engorgement of blood into the erectile tissues like the clitoris, which we see here and here, as well as the bulbs adjacent to the vagina. Whereas the sympathetic response, stimulation, is going to be responsible for secretion of mucus from glands, like these glands that we see, also adjacent, emptying into the, just inside the labia minora, into the vestibule of the female external genitalia. And with that, guys, folks, nervous system is finally done. So pat yourself on the back. You got through it. All we got left is the muscular system, which isn't nearly as long as the nervous system. Not nearly. So good job. As always, if you have questions, shoot me an email. Come see me in office hours. Look forward to hearing from you and talking to you. Bye-bye.